The torpedo left USS Wahoo's forward tube and disappeared into the dark Pacific waters. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane stood at the periscope, counting seconds. At 3,000 yards, a standard attack range by 1943 doctrine, the torpedo should take roughly 90 seconds to reach its target. O'Kane counted past 90 seconds. Nothing. Past 120 seconds. Still nothing. The Japanese freighter steamed on, completely unaware that an American submarine had just tried to kill it. Commander Dudley Morton, everyone called him Mush, slammed his fist against the conning tower wall. Another miss. Another wasted torpedo. Another enemy ship that would deliver its cargo to Japanese forces. This was the third attack that morning where torpedoes fired at regulation range had simply failed to connect. Morton made a decision that would change submarine warfare forever. He turned to O'Kane and said something that contradicted every page of the Navy's tactical manual. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Next time, we get close. Real close. O'Kane thought his commander had lost his mind. The manual explicitly stated that submarine commanders should maintain maximum possible distance from targets. Distance meant safety. Distance meant you could dive and escape before escorts arrived. Distance meant you wouldn't be detected. Morton saw it differently. Distance, he argued, meant your torpedoes had time to malfunction, meant targets had time to maneuver, meant you were firing at shadows and hoping for luck. In early 1943, American submarine warfare was failing, and everyone knew it. Submarines would patrol for weeks, finally spot an enemy convoy, fire torpedoes from 2,000 or 3,000 yards away, then watch in frustration as ships sailed on untouched. The problem wasn't the submarine commander's courage or skill. The problem was they were following doctrine written for weapons that actually worked. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be America's secret weapon in the Pacific. In reality, it was a disaster. The magnetic exploder failed. The contact exploder failed. The depth-keeping mechanism failed. Torpedoes that should have been running at 10 feet would dive to 30 feet and pass harmlessly under targets. Torpedoes that hit dead center would strike but fail to explode. But here's what the Navy brass didn't understand initially. The farther you fired these defective torpedoes, the worse they performed. At 3,000 yards, a torpedo traveled through the water for nearly 2 minutes. 2 minutes where the gyroscope could malfunction. 2 minutes where the depth mechanism could fail. 2 minutes where the target could simply turn, and the torpedo would miss by hundreds of feet. Morton looked at this problem and reached a radical conclusion. If the torpedoes were unreliable, don't give them time to malfunction. Get so close they hit before anything can go wrong. The tactical revolution that followed would transform American submarine warfare from an ineffective harassment campaign into the most devastating naval blockade in history. And it started with one simple, terrifying principle. Get within 800 yards. Fire. Hit them before they even know you're there. Wahoo's third war patrol in January 1943 became the testing ground for Morton's theory. They prowled into the heavily defended waters near Wewak Harbour in New Guinea. Japanese destroyers patrolled constantly. Aircraft circled overhead. This was enemy territory, and Morton was about to take his submarine somewhere no American submarine had gone before, directly into the harbour itself. On January 24, 1943, Morton submerged Wahoo in restricted waters, where one depth charge could crush them against the shallow bottom. O'Kane manned the periscope while Morton called the shots. A 4-ship convoy sat at anchor, absolutely confident in their security. They were in their own harbour, surrounded by their own defences. What they didn't know was that an American submarine was already inside, and it was about to demonstrate why distance in submarine warfare had become obsolete. Morton ordered Wahoo to close to 1,000 yards, then 800 yards. O'Kane later recalled that he could see individual sailors walking on the decks through the periscope. He could read the ship names. At this range, you weren't firing at a target. You were firing at a specific point on a specific ship, knowing exactly where the torpedo would hit. The first torpedo left Wahoo's tube. 7 seconds later, it struck the lead freighter amidship. The explosion was so violent that debris rained down on Wahoo's periscope. Before the Japanese could react, Morton fired again, another hit, then another. In less than 15 minutes, Wahoo systematically destroyed 4 ships at point-blank range. The Japanese never even got their escorts moving. By the time they realized an American submarine was inside their harbor, Wahoo was already slipping out through the entrance, leaving burning ships and chaos behind. What O'Kane learned that day would reshape his entire approach to command. But first, he had to understand why this worked when conventional tactics failed. The mathematics were brutal and simple. At 3,000 yards, a target steaming at 15 knots had nearly 2 minutes to maneuver after you fired. If their lookout spotted the torpedo wake, they could turn, and your weapon would miss by several hundred feet. Even if they didn't spot it, random course changes for navigation meant you were essentially firing at where you hoped they'd be, not where they were. At 800 yards, that equation changed completely. A torpedo running at 46 knots reached its target in 35 seconds. 35 seconds wasn't enough time for a ship to turn. It wasn't enough time for escorts to react. Often, it wasn't even enough time for the lookouts to sound the alarm before the first explosion. You were hitting them before they knew you existed. The other critical factor was torpedo reliability. The Mark 14's defects didn't have time to manifest at close range. A gyroscope that might drift 2 degrees over 2 minutes of travel stayed accurate for 35 seconds. A depth mechanism that might fail catastrophically after 90 seconds worked fine for 35 seconds. The torpedoes were still terrible, but at 800 yards, they were terrible weapons that actually hit their targets. Morton refined the tactic over the next several months. He realized that close-range attacks weren't just about submerged periscope approaches. They worked even better on the surface at night. A submarine's silhouette at night was nearly invisible, just a low shadow against dark water. If you surfaced in the middle of an enemy convoy after dark, you could race between ships like a destroyer, firing torpedoes at ranges where it was physically impossible to miss. The Navy's official doctrine said submarine commanders should avoid detection at all costs. Morton said detection didn't matter if you sank everything before they could respond. He would surface Wahoo in the middle of enemy formations, sometimes with Japanese escorts just 2,000 yards away, and systematically destroy ship after ship before diving and disappearing. O'Kane absorbed every lesson. He learned that at 800 yards, you could fire a single torpedo and be confident of a kill. At 2,000 yards, you needed to fire spreads, multiple torpedoes, hoping one would hit. Close range meant fewer torpedoes expended per ship sunk, which meant more ships sunk per patrol. He learned that surface attacks at night had another advantage beyond invisibility: speed. Submerged, a submarine made 8 or 9 knots. On the surface, 20 knots. When you were attacking from 800 yards, speed meant you could fire, maneuver, and fire again before escorts could coordinate a response. You could chase down fleeing ships. You could reposition between attacks. You became a predator, not a hiding observer. Morton also taught O'Kane something that would become his signature tactic: how to use the chaos of your own attacks as cover. When you hit a tanker at 800 yards and it explodes in a massive fireball, that fire illuminates the entire convoy, but it also blinds the escorts. They can't see your submarine's shadow against burning ships. You can actually move closer, using the flames as concealment, and fire again before anyone realizes you're still on the surface. By July 1943, Wahoo had become the most celebrated submarine in the Pacific Fleet. Morton and O'Kane had proven that aggressive close-range tactics worked. They'd sunk ship after ship using methods that made conservative commanders uncomfortable. The Navy brass couldn't argue with results. Wahoo's confirmed kills spoke louder than any tactical manual. But there was one problem. Morton was teaching these tactics to O'Kane, but who would teach them to the rest of the submarine force? The answer came in October 1943, when the Navy gave O'Kane his own command. USS Tang, a brand-new Balao-class submarine, slid down the ways at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. She was 311 feet of American engineering designed for one purpose: killing Japanese ships. O'Kane hand-picked his officers, many of them veterans who'd served with him on Wahoo. He trained his crew relentlessly during shakedown cruises, drilling them until they could reload torpedoes in darkness, until they could crash dive in under a minute, until every man knew his job so well he could do it half asleep. But the most important training was psychological. O'Kane needed his crew to understand that they would be operating at ranges where other submarines refused to go, that they would be surfacing in the middle of enemy convoys, that they would be firing from distances where the enemy could see them, hear them, and shoot back. Traditional submarine warfare was about stealth and invisibility. O'Kane's approach was about speed, aggression, and precision violence before the enemy could react. Tang departed Pearl Harbor for her first war patrol in January 1944. O'Kane had his orders: disrupt Japanese shipping lanes between Truk and the Marianas. Truk Lagoon served as Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, a massive naval base where their combined fleet sheltered between operations. Any ship moving in or out of Truk was a high-value target. O'Kane positioned Tang along the convoy routes and waited. The waiting ended on February 17, 1944. Tang's radar operator picked up contacts at 18,000 yards. Multiple ships, steaming in formation. Most submarine commanders would have begun a cautious approach, slowly closing the distance while remaining undetected, planning to attack from 3,000 or 4,000 yards. O'Kane ordered battle stations and brought Tang to the surface. In darkness, the submarine was nearly invisible. He closed the range aggressively: 3,000 yards, 2,000 yards, 1,500 yards. At 03:42 hours, O'Kane was at 1,000 yards, close enough to hear the target's engines, close enough to see crew moving on the deck in the darkness. He fired. 45 seconds later, a freighter erupted in flames. The convoy scattered, but O'Kane was already maneuvering for his next shot. This is what Morton had taught him. Don't fire and run. Fire and hunt. Over the next 6 hours, O'Kane demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of point-blank submarine warfare. Tang raced on the surface between targets. He would close to 800 yards, sometimes 600 yards, fire torpedoes from multiple angles, then race to the next target while his crew reloaded. Japanese escorts dropped depth charges where they thought Tang had submerged, but O'Kane stayed on the surface, using his speed and the darkness as cover. By dawn, 2 freighters and 1 tanker lay on the ocean floor. Tang submerged as the sun rose, leaving the Japanese to count their losses. What separated O'Kane from other commanders wasn't just aggression, it was calculated aggression. He studied each target, estimated tonnage, identified the most valuable ships in a convoy, then prioritized his attacks accordingly. Tankers carrying fuel oil rated higher priority than cargo ships. Troop transports topped everything. And because he was attacking from 800 yards instead of 3,000, he could be selective. He wasn't firing spreads and hoping. He was firing single torpedoes at specific ships and watching them sink. On February 22nd, Tang encountered a Sibret, convoy of 5 ships northeast of Truk. O'Kane executed something that seemed insane: a surface approach in broad daylight. Most commanders wouldn't attempt this under any circumstances. Daylight meant visibility. Visibility meant detection. Detection meant you'd be under attack before you could fire. O'Kane positioned Tang between the sun and the convoy, using the glare to mask his approach. The Japanese lookouts were staring directly at where Tang was approaching, but the sun's glare turned the submarine into an invisible shadow. O'Kane closed to 1,200 yards before the lead transport's lookouts finally spotted them. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By then, it was too late. O'Kane fired a spread of 3 torpedoes. 2 hit, breaking the ship's back. She went down in 8 minutes, her cargo of troops and supplies disappearing into 3,000 fathoms of water. The escorts finally reacted and opened fire, but Tang was already at flank speed, zigzagging away while her deck gun returned fire. This engagement proved another advantage of close-range tactics. Even when you were detected, the enemy had to decide in seconds whether you were worth chasing. Every minute they spent pursuing you was a minute they weren't protecting the rest of the convoy. O'Kane would use this principle ruthlessly throughout his career. Tang's first patrol established O'Kane's reputation, but it was the second patrol that proved close-range tactics could dominate even in the most heavily defended waters. In April 1944, Tang departed for the Formosa Strait, the narrow channel between Formosa and mainland China. This was Japan's main supply artery, and it was defended accordingly. Japanese aircraft patrolled constantly. Destroyers prowled in wolf packs. Minefields blocked direct routes. Where other commanders saw a death trap, O'Kane saw targets. On May 1, 1944, Tang's radar picked up a convoy of 7 ships escorted by 3 destroyers moving south through the strait. O'Kane tracked them through the afternoon, studying their formation, noting their patrol patterns. As dusk approached, he made his decision: surface attack at close range after dark. At 21:30 hours, Tang surfaced 4,000 yards from the convoy. O'Kane ordered all ahead flank and closed the distance. By the time Japanese lookouts spotted Tang, she was already at 2,000 yards, too close for the escorts to maneuver effectively, too close for effective evasion. O'Kane fired 6 torpedoes in rapid succession, targeting 3 separate ships. The first torpedo struck a cargo vessel amidship. The explosion was so massive it lit up the night sky like daylight. Before the echoes faded, 2 more torpedoes slammed into a tanker, rupturing her fuel tanks. Burning oil spread across the water in a lake of fire. This is where O'Kane's tactics became truly revolutionary. The Japanese escorts reacted exactly as he predicted. They charged toward where they thought Tang had been, dropping depth charges in a pattern. But Tang was already racing away on the surface at a different angle, and O'Kane wasn't finished. He used the burning tanker as a backlight, silhouetting the other ships in the convoy against the flames. He fired 3 more torpedoes at a transport vessel. 2 hit below the waterline. The transport listed heavily, then capsized in less than 5 minutes. Her crew never had time to launch lifeboats. Over the next 3 weeks, O'Kane turned the Formosa Strait into a killing ground. He developed a pattern: attack at night, sink what you can, dive before dawn, move to a new position during daylight, surface, and hunt again after dark. The Japanese never knew where Tang would appear next. On May 10th, Tang encountered a heavily escorted convoy. 6 cargo ships protected by 4 destroyers. Most commanders, but would have approached cautiously, tried to pick off stragglers, avoided the escorts. O'Kane tracked them for 6 hours instead, studying their formation. He noticed the escorts concentrated their patrols on the flanks but left gaps astern. At midnight, O'Kane positioned Tang directly behind the convoy. At 800 yards, he had a clear shot down the columns of ships. The escorts were looking in the wrong direction. O'Kane fired 4 torpedoes down the convoy columns. 2 cargo ships exploded before the Japanese even knew they were under attack. This became his signature move, finding the gap in escort coverage, exploiting it from point-blank range, hitting ships before alarms could sound. The phrase "before alarms could sound" wasn't metaphorical. At 800 yards, with a 46-knot torpedo, the time from launch to impact was approximately 35 seconds. Japanese ships had specific procedures when under submarine attack. Lookouts would spot the torpedo wake, sound the alarm, The officer of the deck would order evasive maneuvers, the engine room would change speed, the helmsman would execute the turn. This process took time. At 3,000 yards, there was enough time. At 800 yards, the torpedo hit before the helmsman could even put the wheel over. O'Kane refined his fire control techniques throughout the second patrol. Most submarine commanders fired spreads, multiple torpedoes aimed slightly offset to increase hit probability. This made sense at long range, where you were guessing at target course and speed. O'Kane fired spreads too, but his were calculated based on precise data, not guesswork. And because he was so close, his spreads were tight. If he was firing 3 torpedoes at a single ship from 800 yards, they'd be spaced maybe 50 feet apart. This meant even if the ship tried to turn, at least 1 torpedo would hit. Usually all 3 hit. His crew started calling it point-blank submarine warfare. The term spread through the submarine force. Other commanders began studying Tang's patrol reports, trying to understand how O'Kane was achieving such devastating results. The answer was in the range data. Attack from 800 yards instead of 3,000 yards, and suddenly your hit probability went from 30% to 90%. Your torpedoes per ship dropped from 4 or 5 to 1 or 2. Your patrol effectiveness doubled or tripled. By May 23rd, Tang had expended all 24 torpedoes. The tally for the second patrol was staggering. 10 Japanese ships confirmed sunk, totaling over 40,000 tons. No American submarine commander had achieved numbers like that in a single patrol. The Navy awarded O'Kane his second Navy Cross, and Tang's crew received the Presidential Unit Citation. But more importantly, O'Kane had proven his tactics weren't just lucky. They were systematically superior to conventional methods. Tang's third patrol took the fight even deeper into Japanese-controlled waters. The Yellow Sea, connecting Korea to mainland China, was where Japanese convoys moved resources from conquered territories back to the home islands. These waters were shallow, heavily patrolled, and considered secure by the Japanese. O'Kane arrived on June 24, 1944, and immediately began hunting. On July 6th, Tang intercepted a tanker convoy. 5 tankers escorted by 3 destroyers, carrying refined petroleum products. O'Kane positioned Tang ahead of the convoy's projected course and waited at periscope depth. When the lead tanker was 800 yards away, O'Kane fired 2 torpedoes. Both hit forward of the bridge. The tanker's cargo ignited in a massive fireball that could be seen for miles. O'Kane fired 2 more at the second tanker. 1 hit, rupturing her tanks. Crude oil gushed into the sea. The escorts counterattacked with fury, but here's what they didn't understand. O'Kane had fired from 800 yards while submerged. By the time the torpedoes hit and the escorts reacted, Tang had already moved 300 yards from the firing position. The destroyers were dropping depth charges on water Tang had left minutes ago. This was another advantage of close-range attacks. The shorter time from firing to impact meant less time for the submarine to be detected during the attack. At 3,000 yards, the torpedo's wake was visible for 90 seconds, giving escorts time to triangulate the firing position. At 800 yards, the wake was visible for 35 seconds, and by the time anyone reacted, you'd already repositioned. O'Kane took Tang deep and went silent. For 3 hours, the destroyers depth-charged randomly, never getting close to Tang's actual position. When they finally departed, O'Kane surfaced and continued hunting. By the time Tang returned to Pearl Harbor after her third patrol, O'Kane's reputation had transformed from respected commander to legendary hunter. 13 ships sunk in the most dangerous waters in the Pacific, but the fourth patrol would cement his legacy as the most effective submarine commander in American history, and it would demonstrate both the devastating effectiveness and the terrible risks of point-blank submarine warfare. Tang departed Pearl Harbor on September 24, 1944, heading back to the Formosa Strait. American forces were preparing to invade the Philippines, and Japanese convoys were desperately moving reinforcements south. O'Kane's orders reflected the urgency: disrupt Japanese shipping at all costs. The first major contact came on October 10th. Tang's radar picked up a large convoy, 11 ships with multiple escorts. This was exactly what O'Kane had been waiting for. He tracked them through the afternoon, studying their formation, planning his attack. As darkness fell, O'Kane brought Tang to the surface and began his approach at flank speed. At 2,000 yards, he ordered the first spread of torpedoes. He'd identified the three largest targets: a troop transport, a cargo vessel, and a tanker. The torpedoes left Tang's tubes at precisely calculated intervals. First hit on the transport amidship, second hit on the cargo vessel near the stern. The third missed, but O'Kane was already maneuvering for the next attack. He fired 3 more torpedoes at the tanker. 2 hit, rupturing her tanks. Within minutes, the tanker was burning from bow to stern. The convoy scattered in confusion, individual ships breaking formation, trying to evade. This was what O'Kane wanted: isolated targets without coordinated escort protection. Over the next 4 hours, Tang hunted down fleeing ships one by one, close to 800 yards. Fire. Watch it sink, find the next target. By dawn on October 11th, Tang had sunk 4 ships and damaged 2 others. But this was just the beginning. Between October 10th and October 24th, O'Kane orchestrated the systematic destruction of Japanese shipping that would never be equaled. On October 23rd came one of the war's most dramatic engagements. Tang spotted a convoy of 3 tankers with heavy escort, 5 destroyers and 2 patrol boats. These tankers were carrying aviation fuel desperately needed by Japanese air forces defending the Philippines. O'Kane knew the escorts would be aggressive, but the targets were too valuable to pass up. He waited until after midnight, then surfaced Tang in heavy seas. The rough weather worked in his favor. Lookouts on the escorts couldn't spot Tang's low profile in the wave troughs. O'Kane closed to 1,000 yards, then 800 yards, 600 yards. At this range, he could hear the tanker's engines, could see the escort destroyers patrolling just beyond. He fired 6 torpedoes in rapid succession, targeting all 3 tankers. 5 torpedoes hit. The first tanker exploded in a massive fireball that illuminated the entire convoy. The second tanker took 2 hits and broke in half. The third was struck near the stern and began settling rapidly. The escorts went berserk, firing wildly in all directions, dropping depth charges randomly. And O'Kane made the most audacious decision of his career. He kept Tang on the surface, racing between the burning tankers, using the chaos and flames as cover. It was insane. It was brilliant. The Japanese expected the submarine to dive and run. Instead, O'Kane stayed in the middle of the inferno, hunting. He fired 2 more torpedoes at a cargo vessel trying to escape the carnage. Both hit. 7 torpedoes, 5 ships damaged or sunk, and Tang escaped without a scratch. This engagement became legendary among submarine commanders. O'Kane had fired from ranges so close that one crewman later recalled seeing Japanese sailors abandoning ship while Tang was still on the surface nearby. By October 24th, Tang had expended 23 of her 24 torpedoes, 13 enemy ships confirmed sunk in just 14 days. O'Kane had 1 torpedo remaining. The night of October 24th, 25th began like so many others. Tang surfaced near midnight, hunting for one last target. Radar picked up a convoy, 2 transports escorted by several destroyers. O'Kane made his final approach. The sea was calm, visibility good under a quarter moon. He closed to 2,000 yards, then 1,500, then 1,000. His fire control team fed him constant data. Target speed, bearing, range. Everything tracking perfectly. At 02:30 hours on October 25th, O'Kane fired his final torpedo. The Mark 18 electric torpedo left Tang's forward tube and began its run. O'Kane watched through binoculars, counting seconds until impact. Then someone on the bridge shouted a warning. The torpedo's phosphorescent wake was curving. The weapon was running in a circle. Circular runs were a known defect. A malfunction in the gyroscope or steering mechanism could cause the torpedo to loop back toward the firing submarine. O'Kane had seconds to react. He ordered emergency full speed ahead. Tang's diesels roared to maximum power. The submarine surged forward, but the torpedo was already too close. At 02:35 hours, the torpedo struck Tang's stern. The explosion was massive. The blast obliterated the stern section. Tang's stern sank immediately while the forward section tilted upward at a steep angle. O'Kane and 8 other men were on the bridge when the explosion hit. The blast threw them into the water. Inside Tang's forward compartments, 78 men were trapped in a submarine sinking stern first in 180 feet of water. Only 9 survivors remained from Tang's crew of 87. Tang's 4th patrol, the most successful submarine patrol in American naval history, had ended in catastrophe. 24 ships sunk across 4 patrols, but 78 men dead because 1 torpedo malfunctioned. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. O'Kane had spent 4 patrols perfecting the art of firing from 800 yards, hitting enemies before they could react, exploiting every advantage of close-range combat, and in the end, close range killed him too, or nearly did. The Japanese pulled O'Kane and 8 survivors from the water. They spent 9 months in brutal captivity, interrogation, torture, starvation. When American forces liberated the camp on August 29, 1945, O'Kane weighed less than 120 pounds, but he'd survived. And he had to testify about what Tang had accomplished. Post-war analysis confirmed 24 ships, totaling 93,824 tons, sent to the bottom. No other American submarine commander came close. On March 27, 1946, President Harry Truman presented O'Kane with the Medal of Honor. The numbers that defined O'Kane's career became benchmarks for submarine warfare, but his legacy extended beyond statistics. He'd proven that submarine commanders who took calculated risks, who closed to point-blank range, who attacked on the surface at night, could dominate enemy shipping lanes even in heavily defended waters. His tactics became required study at submarine school. Future commanders analysed his patrol reports, learning how he'd positioned Tang, how he'd calculated firing solutions, how he'd exploited the chaos of burning ships. The lessons O'Kane learned from Mush Morton, then refined through 4 patrols, became foundational principles of American submarine warfare. Why did submarine captains start firing from 800 yards? Because at 800 yards, the mathematics changed completely. Torpedo travel time dropped from 90 seconds to 35 seconds. Target evasion became impossible. Mechanical failures had no time to develop. Hit probability increased from 30% to 90%, and most critically, you hit them before alarms could sound, before escorts could react, before anyone even knew you were there. The phrase, "hit them before alarms could sound," became tactical doctrine. It meant you were operating at ranges where the enemy's reaction time was slower than your weapon's travel time, where their training and procedures couldn't save them because your torpedo arrived faster than their response. Morton had invented the concept. O'Kane had perfected it. And together, they'd proven that in submarine warfare, distance wasn't safety. Distance was just an opportunity for things to go wrong. Close range meant certainty, meant precision, meant you dictated the terms of engagement. The Japanese learned to fear American submarines prowling their home waters, but they particularly feared Tang, because when Tang attacked, the first indication was usually the explosion. No warning, no alarm, just sudden, devastating violence from 800 yards away. O'Kane retired from the Navy in 1957 as a rear admiral. He spent his post-war years writing about submarine warfare, teaching tactics, and honouring the memory of the men who died aboard Tang. He never forgot that his success came at tremendous cost. 78 families received telegrams. Every ship Tang sank represented a tactical victory. But the final torpedo represented the random cruelty of war, where a mechanical failure could erase everything in seconds. Richard O'Kane died on February 16, 1994, at age 83. His ashes were scattered at sea. The revolution in submarine warfare that began with Commander Dudley Mush Morton and reached its full potential under Commander Richard O'Kane didn't just shift tactics, it rewrote the rules of naval engagement. Before their innovations, American submarines in the Pacific were little more than nuisances to the Japanese Navy. They patrolled with caution, fired from long range, and relied on luck more than skill. Many torpedoes missed. Many patrols returned home empty-handed. Doctrine at the time emphasized safety over aggression, range over precision. Submarine warfare was seen as a slow, patient game of waiting for opportunity rather than creating it. Morton and O'Kane changed all that. When Morton took command of the USS Wahoo, he inherited a demoralized crew and a legacy of indecisive submarine tactics. The war in the Pacific was in full swing, and American submarines were expected to play a major role in cutting Japan's supply lines. But early results were disappointing. Faulty torpedoes, timid command decisions, and rigid adherence to outdated doctrines turned the U.S. submarine fleet into an underperforming force. The official manuals dictated that attacks be launched from safe distances 3,000 yards or more to minimize the risk of counterattack. But in practice, that meant torpedoes were often fired from beyond effective range, and targets were missed or only lightly damaged. Morton didn't see caution as virtue. He saw it as failure. He believed that a submarine, properly handled, could be an offensive weapon, a predator, not a skittish observer. When he took Wahoo to sea, he began closing the distance to his targets, defying doctrine and trusting his instincts. The difference was measurable, brutal, and immediate. Instead of attacking from 3,000 yards, Morton ordered his torpedoes launched from 800 yards. That meant less time for the enemy to maneuver, fewer chances for torpedo errors to multiply over distance, and a dramatically higher hit rate. But it also meant risk. At such close range, even a single mistake, a premature detonation, a missed shot, or a malfunctioning torpedo could expose the submarine to depth-charge retaliation. It was audacious and dangerous, but Morton believed that decisive aggression was the only way to make submarines matter in this war. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, shared that conviction and refined it into an art. Together, they turned submarine warfare into a science of precision, timing, and controlled aggression. The concept was simple: attack before the enemy even knew what was happening. 800 yards instead of 3,000. 35 seconds of exposure instead of 90. Speed and surprise became the heart of their method. Morton's patrols became legendary. The Wahoo prowled Japanese shipping lanes with lethal intent, sinking ship after ship with surgical efficiency. The crew came to trust Morton's boldness because it worked. He broke every rule in the book and wrote new ones with each successful attack. Yet even as Wahoo carved its name into history, Morton's philosophy was evolving into something greater, something that O'Kane would later perfect aboard the USS Tang. O'Kane had learned under Morton's command, absorbing every lesson about daring, timing, and precision. But he added something of his own, a level of discipline and coordination that transformed aggression into doctrine. On Tang, he refined Morton's tactics to their purest form. Where Morton's approach had been instinctive, O'Kane's was methodical. He developed a near-mathematical understanding of engagement range, target movement, and torpedo speed. Every attack was rehearsed in his mind before it was executed. He drilled his crew relentlessly until their maneuvers were second nature. Under O'Kane, the Tang became the deadliest submarine of World War II. In just 5 patrols, she sank 24 Japanese ships, more than any other US submarine in history. And she did it all with astonishing precision, striking from ranges so close that the enemy often never sounded the alarm. What made this revolution so extraordinary was not just its success, but its simplicity. Morton and O'Kane didn't invent new technology. They didn't receive any special intelligence. They didn't have better torpedoes or faster engines than other submarines. They simply changed how they thought about the battlefield. Instead of accepting that submarines were slow and defensive, they treated them as fast, lethal hunters that could dominate any shipping lane. This shift in mindset, this rejection of conventional wisdom, was what transformed submarine warfare. Before Morton and O'Kane, submarines were used to harass the enemy. After them, submarines became the decisive instrument of economic warfare. By the end of the war, Japan's merchant fleet was shattered. Its supply lines were severed. Raw materials, food and fuel could no longer reach the home islands. Factories stalled. Ships lay idle. Armies starved. It was not aircraft carriers or battleships that delivered this strangulation. It was the silent, unseen submarines that Morton and O'Kane had redefined. And yet, even in triumph, there was tragedy. The USS Tang lies today in 180 feet of water off the coast of Formosa, her hull cracked and rusted but still recognizable and beneath the silt. 78 American sailors remain entombed within her steel shell. They died not from enemy fire, but from a cruel accident. Tang's own torpedo malfunctioned, circled back, and struck the submarine that had launched it. In an instant, victory turned to disaster. Only 9 men survived, captured and imprisoned until war's end. Among them was O'Kane himself, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership and valor. The Tang's resting place is a war grave, a silent reminder of the razor's edge between genius and catastrophe in warfare. It stands as proof that even perfect tactics cannot eliminate the chaos of combat or the unpredictability of machines. But the Tang's legacy endures far beyond that tragic patrol. It endures in every navy that adopted close-range, precision-driven submarine tactics after the war. It endures in the doctrine of modern undersea warfare, where stealth and decisive action remain paramount. And it endures in the memory of 2 men who refused to accept good enough. Morton asked the unthinkable question, "What if we're doing it wrong?" O'Kane provided the answer. Together, they created a model of warfare that exemplified American ingenuity, the willingness to challenge authority, to test limits, to find new ways of fighting when old ways failed. They proved that war rewards not just bravery, but imagination. Their story isn't just about ships sunk or tonnage destroyed. It's about the evolution of thought under pressure, the courage to discard tradition, and the clarity to see a better way when lives depend on it. The Tang's final resting place off Formosa is more than a tomb. It is a monument to innovation, discipline, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Each rivet, each twisted beam of her hull tells a story of men who refuse to surrender to fear or convention. The ocean has claimed them, but their impact still ripples through history. Submarine warfare after Morton and O'Kane would never be the same. No longer were submarines passive observers or long-range snipers. They became assassins, silent, close, and unstoppable. The Japanese merchant fleet, once a lifeline stretching across the Pacific, became a graveyard of shattered hulls. Every ship sunk was another blow to Japan's war machine, another reminder that the sea belonged to those bold enough to master it. Even decades later, naval historians trace the turning point of the Pacific submarine campaign not to a new weapon or breakthrough technology, but to a change in attitude, a shift from fear to confidence, from caution to command. That shift began with Morton's question and reached perfection in O'Kane's execution. Their legacy is measured not only in victories, but in the philosophy they left behind, that innovation is born from defiance and progress from those willing to risk failure. Today, when submariners train in simulators or study the great patrols of World War II, they still learn Morton and O'Kane's lessons. They learn that range means nothing without resolve, and that speed and courage can achieve what technology alone cannot. They learn that every doctrine, no matter how sacred, must be questioned in the light of experience. The revolution they started wasn't just tactical, it was human. It was about the power of vision in a time of crisis, the courage to trust one's instincts, and the relentless pursuit of mastery even in the most unforgiving environment on Earth. 800 yards instead of 3,000, 35 seconds instead of 90. That was the difference between failure and victory, between fear and dominance. Simple, revolutionary, effective, and written forever in the shattered hulls of 24 Japanese ships and in the steel tomb of the Tang, resting silently beneath the waves, bearing witness to the men who dared to change the world beneath the sea. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.